I thought I would start off by giving people just a very brief overview of peatlands and bogs or mires. They've got various different names, and there's several different types. So I'm going to do a whistle-stop tour of some of the different the main peatland and bog types that we get across Northern Ireland and Ireland, just to set the scene and give us a bit of context here about the kind of landscapes that we're talking about before we start talking about the bugs and the beasties that we get on them. So yeah, bogs, peatlands, mires, variations of the same thing, and then you get swamps and all sorts of different stuff. They're a type of wetland habitat, waterlogged soil, one of our greatest carbon stores, brilliant landscapes for sequestering CO2, but also for filtering water, for reducing flooding, loads of ecosystem services. But they're pretty harsh places to survive in. There's not a lot of nutrients about, and they're usually in remote places and pretty hard to survive on. But we've got three main types that I want to just cover here, because a lot of the species that we're going to talk about thrive in some of these different habitat types. So the first one are blanket bogs, and these blanket are upland areas in Northern Ireland and Ireland. So if you think of places in like the Sperrins or the Antrim Hills, parts of the Mournes, or this picture here is actually of Culca Mountain out in southwest Fermanagh. Many of you'll probably have seen or been to the boardwalk up there. And yeah, these are really wet places, get loads of rainfall because of the altitude and the latitude that we're at here. And yeah, they're called blanket bogs because they literally blanket the landscape. And then in the lowlands, we get lowland raised bogs. And now that often causes confusion because the raised thing often makes people think that they should be high up. But actually they're called lowland raised bogs because they have this dome shape where they rise up in the middle. And this is one of our nature reserves, actually. This site is Balnahone Bog. And Ireland as an island is absolutely covered in lowland raised bogs. They're one of our real sort of jewels in this part of the world in terms of habitats. So they are, again, very similar to blanket bogs, but in a lowland setting, much deeper peat soils, where a blanket bog might, in most cases, only be about 2 or 3 meters deep of peat. Lowland raised bogs like Balnahone here can be more than 10 meters deep. So they're completely different ball game there, with huge stores of carbon, which is one of the reasons why they're very important as well. And the last one I just want to touch on are fens. And fens are a different kind of peatland. They are still very waterlogged areas, very, very important wetlands, but they get their water from underneath, from ground sources. So they have a lot more nutrients to them, and that makes them a lot more species rich. And that actually leads to them having a lot more biodiversity on them in many cases, even though they tend to be a lot smaller in their scale. So in some parts of County Down, in and around the Kiel area, there's lots of really beautiful fens that are designated sites. This site here in this picture is called Corbally, and it's sort of in between Dundrum and Downpatrick part of the world, heading towards Torella. And lots of nice open bits of water there, and lots of nice reed bed and loads of herbs, and that gets loads of different invertebrates associated with it as well. So I'm going to jump into a few of the different invertebrates, the bugs and the beasties then that we find on some of these different peatland habitats and some of these bogs. I'm going to start off with butterflies and moths, because that's something I'm really interested in. And I'm interested in it all, but I'm really keen on butterflies and moths. And then I'm going to move into some of the other groups like dragonflies, damselflies, bees, beetles, spiders, those sorts of things. And I'll finish off by giving a few examples of places that people can go and visit to try and see some of these things. So I'll start off with the butterflies, as I say. And the first one is, in my opinion, the bog butterfly. And that is the large heath. And we are really blessed with large heath in Northern Ireland here. They are the archetypal butterfly of our lowland raised bogs in particular. You do also get them in blanket bog situations as well, but in terms of their absolute, like, their happiest, they love a lowland raised bog. And their caterpillars feed on that really sort of beautiful cotton grass plant there. It's the hare's tail cotton grass, particularly, that the caterpillars feed on. So they feed on that in the latter half of the year, and then they pupate, and then they emerge in the middle of the summer as these quite sort of drab, but really quite beautiful butterflies. And you can tell them they're different to the small heath, which is also another peatland butterfly, which looks quite similar. These guys are bigger, hence the name, but they almost have this like dozy, like dopey flight whenever they're going around a bog, and you can almost kind of tell like they're just a lot more chilled out and they're not really that worried about getting around the place. They're just a bit more laid back. And they've got this distinctive orange kind of patch on their forewing there, on the underside. And you'll rarely ever see, in fact, I'm fairly sure you'll never see a large heath with its wings sitting open, rather than them closed like that. You often find them sitting on pieces of heather or something out on the bog, on a really nice sunny day, or if you can catch them at the beginning of the day before things warm up when they're still. But the thing that also sets them apart from the small heath, other than the size and their dopey flight, is the little black dots then on the base of that forewing that you can see. And actually, it's kind of crazy. They vary. Those black dots vary actually depending on where you are. So in Ireland, we are kind of in the middle of the road bit where they are kind of, they're noticeable, but they're not gigantic. But if you go to the south of England, in some of the sites where you get large heath there, then those black dots are huge. They're massive. And then when you go to Scotland, then they're really, really tiny. So it's kind of strange how they vary all across the different landscapes. But in Northern Ireland, they are, as you can see from this map here, really heavily associated with where all of our peatland is. And that generally is north and west. So poor old County Down doesn't really have a huge amount of large heath in it, unfortunately. But you look at areas like the Antrim Hills, Tyrone with all of its peatland habitats, and Fermanagh as well, and real hotspot for them in that southwest corner of Lough Neagh. For anybody that knows where Peatlands Park is, great place to see large heath butterfly. And next on to a much more colourful butterfly of the bog, which is the green hairstreak. And these are amazing butterflies. These are like, when you kind of think of the sort of butterflies you might come across out in some of the kind of like the tropics or the Mediterranean, this is more what you would kind of think you would come across. And green hairstreaks are really a butterfly of the bog edge. So where you've got things like bilberry, which is the food plant of the caterpillar, there's a picture there of the bilberry with its berry on there later in the year, and the caterpillars feed on that during the late summer. But they're really heavily associated with things like gorse and birch scrub. So if you think of the edge of a bog where you've got trees that are starting to encroach in and kind of come around the edges of it, especially like young birch, stuff that's maybe about 5 or 6 feet tall, it's only a few years old. And one of the reasons why they're so heavily associated with that is you think of this bright green color of this butterfly whenever it emerges in May and June time. It looks absolutely identical to a newly opened birch leaf. And I thought I had a photograph on my phone of this, but I could not find it for the life of me. But whenever you see it out in the field, you see a green hairstreak adult, and like when it's not that long merged, land on a newly sort of opened birch tree, you will struggle to see it. And it's just one of those amazing things where you can see how it's evolved so specifically to camouflage in that landscape there. Yeah, it's really, really nice. There's such nice butterflies, and that iridescent green is just so distinctive. We don't have anything else that looks like that. And they are, yeah, that bog edge where you get the woodland kind of integrating into the open bog, that's where they are. And yeah, really nice to see on a sunny day. Then a butterfly which is really important and very heavily protected across the whole of Europe, believe it or not, is the marsh fritillary. And now I got marsh fritillary in here because it's not, strictly speaking, a bog butterfly. It is again sort of a butterfly of the bog edge, or very, very happy in those fen habitats. And the reason that it's happier in those fen habitats is because its food plant, which is a plant called devil's bit scabious, that's what the caterpillars eat, which there's a picture of there in the top right hand corner. It's got these beautiful kind of very pale purple flowers late in the summertime. They can be very, very prolific in some of our fen habitats. They like nutrient poor, kind of waterlogged soils with a little bit of grazing going in. But their caterpillars are kind of strange. So usually whenever you see caterpillars of moths and butterflies, they tend to be on their own. They tend to just go and feed on, whether it's red admirals feeding on nettles, or peacocks or whatever. Marsh fritillary caterpillars feed in these little communal groups. So they create these silken webs, which I know we call them webs, and they are kind of like they are silken webs, but they actually look like balls of snot whenever you see them out in the field. They're really not that nice to see. But they tiny little caterpillars, absolutely minuscule little caterpillars that congregate in these webs all together, and they feed, they kind of wrap it around the leaves of the devil's bit scabious, and they eat away at it, and then they kind of like an amoeba kind of move from one to the next using these webs of silk. But the adults are one of the nicest butterflies that you could find on any of our peatland areas. These beautiful kind of stained glass window effect of oranges and pale yellows. When you see a fresh one, they're so colorful and so distinctive. So if you're very lucky to come across one of these, it'll be kind of May, June time, on nice sunny days, and later in the year on really good days, you might be lucky enough to come across the caterpillars feeding in the webs in like August, September, or even later in the year. But it's worth noting that Marsh fritillary it's an Annex 2 species, so it's actually protected at a European level, as I said. So you actually need a license to be able to even like disturb them or survey them. But if you just happen to come across one, they are such a nice thing to find. Not a bog site, but actually a great place to see them is Murlock National Nature Reserve in County Down, managed by the National Trust. They love peatlandy kind of habitats and wet grasslandy kind of habitats, but they also, for some strange reason, like sand dunes, and it's because they follow the devil's bit scabious plant. So I'm going to move on before I get taken away on butterflies and move on to moths. So one of the best moths, arguably the best moth potentially, that you can find on our peatland habitats, and it is really a very, like, it's a peatlandy species as well, is the emperor moth. So this is the only moth species that is the same member of a member of the same family as the silkworm moth that we get here in Ireland. And the male is that really bright orangey red kind of colors with those eye spots on it on the bottom left or on the left hand side. And then the female, still very showy with the eye spots, but it's more of a gray and black and pink shades. And the caterpillar is one of the craziest things that you will ever come across when you're out on a bog. It's this Frankenstein looking green thing, big fat caterpillar with these spikes, yellow sort of spotty spikes all over it. And they move about like some sort of weird, creepy creature. It's always such a joy to actually find them out on the bogs. They're amazing, and they feed on heather. So the caterpillars feed on heather, and then they pupate and turn into these absolutely amazing adult moths. But if you want to see one of these adult moths, you need to get out early in the day in like April, May time, because see, once it warms up, these things just fly around like headless chickens going at 1,000,000 miles an hour, and you will never spot them. It'll just be like this blur going past you. They have no idea what it was. You might be able to tell that it was probably an emperor moth, but you won't get any kind of look at it. But if you're really lucky, you get one of those days in the springtime where it's still pretty cold in the morning. What these guys often do is they kind of crawl up to the top of heather stems and stuff, and then they bask. So you can get it at that time of the day, get some amazing views of them. And they're actually, believe it or not, relatively common. So it's actually quite easy to spot these in a lot of peatland habitats that you can get to. So definitely one to keep an eye out for. Now my favorite peatland moth though is actually this one, and this is the argent and sable. And argent and sable is an old-timey, I think is it Old English or something? I can't quite remember. It might be Old English for black and white. And for obvious reasons, looking at this moth. And the caterpillars of the argent and sable feed on bog myrtle and young birch in some parts of the world. But in this part of the world, in Ireland, they generally tend to feed on bog myrtle, which is a species which is very heavily associated with bog habitats, obviously. But late in the year, kind of late in the summer, sorry, in July time, it's the peak flight period for argent and sable. And if you get a good sunny day in the west of Northern Ireland or in Donegal, then you might have a chance of coming across these. So it has a very, very western distribution. It doesn't tend to be found in the east of the country. I've got the map here, which shows its distribution, and its real stronghold in Northern Ireland is in West Fermanagh. So if you're up in areas in and around Loch Navar, maybe some of the forests in and around West Fermanagh, or Coca, or out in West Tyrone even maybe, then you might get lucky enough to come across one of these in a nice sunny day. They're so, so beautiful whenever you see them in the flesh. And then a few more moths then just to finish up, and then I'm going to stop talking about moths, because I can talk about moths forever. These are some other really enigmatic species that you get on some of our bogs. And more often than not, the way that you will actually come across them is in the form of their caterpillars. So on the left-hand side, we've got drinker moths. And these things, whenever they're adult moths, are these crazy little ginger woolly rhinoceroses that look absolutely mad. But as a caterpillar, they've got these really cool kind of bright orange streaks with blue threaded through them. And the reason they're actually called a drinker moth is because, as you can see in this picture, in cooler days and cooler evenings, they will actually gather dew on the long hairs that come off the caterpillar. And then whenever they kind of get saturated, they will move the dew up their body along the hairs up to their mouth, and they will actually drink it. And that's, I don't really know why they do that in these situations, because there's so much water around on bogs, but it's an adaptation that they've developed, and it's so, so cool. And whenever you see them like this, and you do see them quite a lot, covered in dew like this, it looks amazing. With all those colors kind of refracted through all those little water droplets. It's so, so beautiful. And a couple of very similar caterpillars then that you very regularly come across out in the bog. Fox moth caterpillar up on the top right-hand corner. See them all the time. These big black and ginger woolly caterpillars that you can get really, really quite big out in the bog whenever you're walking around. You can come across them. And the adults then are these quite large. That's a female fox moth there. The male is more of an orangey color. And the oak agar caterpillars look very similar to a fox moth, but they have these white dots, and they have more banding on them. And then the adult moth does look quite similar to fox moth as well, but it has these white dots, and it doesn't have the two bands on it like the fox moth does above. So those three caterpillars there are actually very, very easily seen out on a lot of sites, and they're really amazing to find whenever you do. So keep an eye out for them. Now I've done with moths. I'm going to go into beetles. And some of the beetles that we get on some of our bogs, in my opinion, are some of the best. So I'll start off with the big picture on the right. This, although it looks like something you would maybe come across in the middle of the Amazon, this is a green tiger beetle, and they are not common, but you have a fairly good chance of coming across one on some of the peatland sites that you get across Northern Ireland. Places in the Mournes really great to spot them. Some parts of Antrim really good to see them. You might even be able to spot them in some of the peatlandy bits in our Slieve McCloy Nature Reserve in the Belfast Hills potentially. And they are vicious, not to people, don't worry. They are still only about 2.5 centimeters long, but they are the equivalent of the lion or the tiger of the invertebrate world on our peatland sites. They're really fast, unbelievably fast. They move so, so quickly. So if you ever spot one, usually what you end up doing, or what you end up seeing, is somebody, or they running really, really quickly, and then they actually jump and then open their wings and fly for like maybe 5 or 6 feet, and then land again and then run. And they're just amazing. The color is so bright green. Picture doesn't even really do it justice whenever you see it shining in the sunshine. And their larvae are terrifying wee critters as well. They actually create little holes in the ground where they know that other insects like caterpillars or ants or spiders will be passing along, and they create pitfall traps. So they actually create them on the paths of other insects, and they wait for them to fall into them, and then they devour them. And then the adults have got these massive big mandibles, these huge big jaws that they use to just tear things like ants and spiders apart. They're terrifying. On a similar vein, we have carabid beetles, and carabid beetles like Glabratus and Carabus nitens then in the top left are some of our bigger predatory beetles that we get in peatland sites. And Glabratus is a monster of a beetle. It's about a couple of, like, 1.5 to 2 inches long in some places whenever you come across it. And it's it's really impressive. And you will get it in some of our more like mountainous areas. So again, like high points of the Sperrins, in the Mourns, Antrim Hills, those sorts of places. You might not see a lot of other insect life dotted about going around the heather, but you might come across this huge beetle kind of patrolling the place looking for unsuspecting spiders or caterpillars in order to devour them. And Carabus nitens is the same. But Carabus nitens is one of the nicest, um, like most impressive beetles that I've ever actually. Actually, that's a lie. I've never actually seen one. My other half has seen one, and I've never actually managed to see one. But they're really quite rare in Northern Ireland, but you can find them in a few new places or a few places that you can relatively easily access. So there's actually been quite a few new or few records that have come in recent years from the Belfast Hills. So up and around Divis, or Slieve na Cloy, great places to potentially look out for this really, really beautiful species. And the last one we have on there is the hieroglyphic ladybird, which I don't know whether anybody has ever come across or heard of. So it is called a hieroglyphic ladybird because it has these shapes, basically, that look a bit like hieroglyphs, and they vary. They can change depending on. Oh, flip me. Who is Kitty? Could they potentially stop drawing on the screen?
It's just about to write in. Yeah, if you don't mind, if anyone knows how to get rid of that as well, potentially.
Yeah. Apologies for that.
Not quite sure myself.
I wonder, is there an eraser? Oh, hold on.
Oh, there you
There's
go.
that disappeared. There we go. Okay.
Perfect.
Right, we're gone. And now I'm glad I found out that tool. I didn't know that existed. Yes, the hieroglyphic ladybird. The shapes on the back of it can be quite varied. So they can look like hieroglyphs, Egyptian hieroglyphs, and they are really heavily associated with heather, which is obviously a very abundant plant on our bogs. And they feed on the larvae and the eggs of another beetle species called heather beetle. And some people, if you've been out in bog or peatland sites before, you might have seen areas, big extensive areas, where the heather has just kind of died back. And that can happen in many situations because you get this boom in a population of this beetle called heather beetle. And the larvae actually eat heather, and they can decimate huge big hillsides or areas of bog in like bumper years. And this ladybird actually feeds on the larvae and the eggs of that heather beetle. So it's very heavily associated with them. So whenever the heather beetle has a boom, then the hieroglyphic ladybird will boom and then kind of follow behind that as well. So just wanted to show you then a map of for Carabus nitens then, of where you can actually see that potentially see that beetle. So as you can see there is a few good records in and around the Belfast Hills, but quite a few other ones from up in Antrim. And then, as you can see, it's very heavily associated with other uplandy kind of areas. So the Mourns, another good spot potentially to see one. But if you do see one, cannot recommend or cannot advise people enough, submit your records using CEDAR, so the Centre for Environmental Data and Recording, or the National Biodiversity Network, their Atlas. Just some of these species are really quite rare and quite uncommon. So if you do come across anything that looks even remotely like these, try and get a photograph and see if you can submit a record and get it verified, because especially some of these kind of species, they're really under-recorded. So we don't have a great handle on exactly where they might be. So just a wee bit of a call for more citizen science there if you can. Now this one's great. This is not yet found in Northern Ireland, but it is creeping ever northwards. And if you're ever in the Midlands of Ireland, which is the real kind of kingdom of lowland raised bogs, you have a chance of seeing a raft spider, which is the largest spider in Ireland. And you can see there one beside my hand that I photographed down in the Midlands, somewhere near, what was it, Longford maybe, I think it was that I was. They are big. Now it's not like a tarantula or anything, but you can kind of see there it's bigger, a good bit bigger than, whenever you think you see a big house spider in the house, it is definitely a good bit bigger than those. But despite the fact that they are the biggest spider that we get in Ireland, they're really heavily associated with these lowland raised bog habitats, and the really waterlogged parts of our lowland raised bog habitats, because they actually walk on water. The reason they're called raft spiders is because they actually travel across water. They use the surface tension of their really light bodies to creep across water, and they kind of sit and wait for things like pond skaters or other small invertebrates just below the surface to unsuspectingly come past them, and then they pounce on them and grab them. So they are, as I say, creeping further and further northwards, and there is now records of them being found in Leitrim. And I would not be surprised with climate change. We're seeing a lot of species moving further and further north. I would have thought that it's not unrealistic to think that in the next few years, maybe the next decade or something, we could start to be seeing raft spiders start to appear in places like Armagh or in around Lough Neagh, southern side of Lough Neagh or Fermanagh, for example. So keep an eye out. If you see an absolutely massive spider on the edge of a bog or in a wetland, then see if it's a raft spider. And that just shows you there the distribution then currently. So you can see they're really concentrated in the Midlands, quite a few of them out in the west. But up that west coast, they're creeping into Leitrim. Just a wee jump and they'd be into Fermanagh. And this is a bit of an odd one. I thought I would kind of touch on because it's something very interesting on a new site that we started working on. So this is Hockeys Bog, this absolutely horrible looking place that you can see there in that picture. We've purchased it. It's a previously milled and cut over peats lowland raised bog, and we're going to restore it. But in its current state, it's not exactly hospitable to much life, to be honest. There's very little vegetation even on it. But one of the things that I found whenever we were out, we were monitoring the water table on the site, I came across in a few situations these little spiders that were running around in amongst the cracked and kind of desiccated bare peat whenever I was measuring the water table. And this is the absolutely terrible photograph that I managed to get on my phone, so I can only apologize for that. But I put it on to Twitter and I asked a load of very, very knowledgeable people who knew a lot about spiders, whether they had any idea what this might be. And the consensus was that it was actually a species called the sand bear spider. And believe it or not, as you would maybe assume from the name, it is very heavily associated with coastal areas, beaches, sand dunes, those sorts of things, where it burrows into the sand and it kind of goes in amongst little cracks and fissures in the sand and hunts prey. But in Ireland, it is for some reason taken a shine to areas of completely degraded and cut over peat bog. I found a little piece in the British Spider Society or the British Arachnoid Society or something. I can't remember exactly what it was. And they actually had a thing in from a previous colleague of ours, Adam Mantell, who had said that there was a strange association with this species on degraded raised bogs in Ireland. And you'll see some of those other dots on that map are in the Midlands there, and they are from previously cut over sites. And I can only imagine that this is because that really cracked, desiccated peat is in some way similar to what you might find in like sandy kind of coastal areas. But what really doesn't make any sense to me is how on earth did they get there in the first place? You know, it's a heck of a jump to go from somewhere like, I don't know, like Dundalk to get into the Midlands if you're pretty keen on sand. So that's a bit of an enigma. Anybody has any ideas about that, then please let me know. Now on to the dragonflies and the damselflies. And now there is a lot of different dragonflies and damselflies that we get on our peatland sites. And some of them can be quite hard to tell apart, but some of them are very, very obvious. One which is very, very obvious is the large red damselfly. It's the only red damselfly that we get in Ireland. And so it's completely obvious. Damselflies and dragonflies, then the difference between them, just in case anybody doesn't know, damselflies tend to be a lot smaller and they a lot more kind of fragile looking, but they then, when they land, they often fold their wings in along their abdomen. Whereas dragonflies, the larger ones, they tend to have fixed wings that they stay out whenever they land, and they tend to be a bit more stocky and sturdy. So you can see here, that's a large red damselfly on the top, and then a common hawker is a dragonfly. So you can see the distinction there between them. The large red damselfly, really distinctive. very, very easy to spot in and around the edges of very wet parts of the bog, kind of pool systems, things like that. And common hawker is a really, really amazing species to spot on sort of open ponds or open areas of water on our bogs and our fens. And they're called hawkers because they have this behavior of kind of hawking back and forth over the same area. They kind of patrol a particular spot, and they will just go back and forth picking off daddy longlegs and other invertebrates that are flying around, or damselflies that they're perfectly happy to eat them as well. And the other one that I have on here, which is a much harder one to spot, a much harder one to identify actually, is the Irish damselfly. And that is obviously unique to Ireland. And the way that you can tell it apart is with the little markings on the abdomen, or sorry, the thorax then, no, the abdomen, at the top of the abdomen. You can see there's a little triangle-y kind of arrow shape there with a line underneath it. And actually the males in particular, you can't quite see it in this photograph, but the underside of their face is very, very green. And these are some of the features that kind of tell it apart from the numerous other blue damselflies that you could potentially see in some of our bogs. Things like the blue-tailed damselfly, or the common blue damselfly, or the azure damselfly. There's quite a variety of blue damselflies that we get across Ireland, but the Irish one, there's a few good spots to potentially go and try and find it. There's Loch Alabama out in West Fermanagh, or actually RSPB Munchies Moss Nature Reserve on the edge of Loch Ney. Really, really great place to potentially go and see those there. But just a couple more. Common darters, black darters, and four-spotted chasers. So common darters and black darters, actually the males of those species are very distinctive, and these are ones that differ between the male and the female. So you can see there in the top left, that's a common darter male, red color, and then the female then below is this yellowy color. But actually a female black darter is a very yellowy color, has more black underneath than that common darter female does. But the males are very distinctive. So if you ever see the red one, then it's usually a common darter, and then a black one, then it's usually a male black darter. Common darters, do get them on bogs, but they're much more generalist kind of species. You get them on the edges of big lakes and everything. Whereas black darters, they're a real bog specialist species. So we see them all the time whenever we're out surveying peatland sites in the middle of the summer. They love flooded drains. So whenever we've blocked up drains on some of our peatland sites that we've restored, one of the things that we might see in the next number of years after the pools have kind of established is black darters starting to fly around above them. Really, really nice butterfly, or really, really nice dragonflies to see. And then another, again, very enigmatic species of bogs, and probably the most common dragonfly that you're likely to see on our peatland habitats, is the four-spotted chaser. And it's very handy to identify, because if it stops on a nice piece of rush or a reed or something along those lines, then you can see that it has on each side 4 spots. And that is how you tell it apart from the other ones. It's this lovely, like, kind of bronzy color as well, which sets it apart from some of the other ones. And it will frantically kind of fly around on top of pools, trying to catch flies and other flying invertebrates. And perfectly happy to eat things like butterflies and moths as well. And yeah, I always think that they tend to lift off of a piece of vegetation and then zoom around loads, and then kind of land back in exactly the same spot again, before doing it again 2 seconds later. But yeah, just a few examples then of some of the dragonflies and damselflies that we get across some of our peatland sites. And the peak of the summer is really the best time for you to be able to see all of these species. So starting in around June time, going into July, August, and even then into September time, you sometimes, get good weather in September, and you will get species like black darters, and particularly actually common hawkers. You can end up getting right up into the very, very end of the summer and into the early autumn then as well. And then lastly, I wanted to touch on bees. So a few kind of very specific species that I relate then to peatlands. So I'll start off with the heath bumblebee in the middle there, which looks like the whitetail or the buff-tailed or the garden bumblebee that some people might see in in your garden or in just bumbling around your house. It is very slightly different. It looks very similar to a garden bumblebee, but it has a much smaller face and it's much smaller bumblebee itself, actually. But to distinguish it from the more common whitetail and bufftail bumblebees, it has one yellow band behind its head, and then it has two yellow bands then on its abdomen before you have the white bum at the bottom. And it's very heavily associated with our heathland kind of habitat. So if you're out in the Belfast Hills and Mourns or something like that, very, very good chances that if you see a bumblebee that looks like one of those more common species in those kind of habitats, it's very possible that it's a heath bumblebee and not one of those other species. Calides succinctus is a really nice solitary bee. And this one I included after chatting to my other half, who is obsessed with bees, and she's doing a talk later on, actually. Calides succinctus it feeds exclusively on heather. So whenever the bees are going out looking for nectar, they will look no further than any other heather species. That's the only thing they need. So they're very heavily associated with that. Then you get some on the coast in some coastal heathland sites, and then you'll get them inland in some of our bogs. My other half discovered the first colony in North Fermanagh a good number of years ago. And they're a bit of a strange species because they're a solitary bee and they nest in a little hole that they burrow themselves, but they do that communally. So where you actually tend to find them is if you have maybe like an old bit of exposed peat just on a bank or something, then where that peat's exposed, they burrow in, create these little burrows, which they then lay their eggs in, and they then pupate in there and then emerge then the following year. But they do it in groups. So even though they nest individually, they actually then congregate together in larger groups. So if you're out in some of our more kind of remote peatland sites, maybe like in Pedigo Plateau in North Fermanagh or out in West Tyrone, then if you see some of these wee solitary bees, then it's very possible it could be one of these Calides species. They're really quite dainty, but they're really, really nice. And my personal favorite then on the bees front is this species here, which this little video is of, and the picture in the middle there, which is the bilberry bumblebee or the mountain bumblebee. And the best place for you to spot that at the minute in Northern Ireland is in the Antrim Hills, which is where I recorded this video. And it's very distinctive. So it's very, very obsessed with heather, particularly, which is why it's it's found in those sorts of areas there. But it also loves bilberry, which is where it gets that name from. But it's also called the mountain bumblebee as well, because rather than being found in lowland peatland sites, it tends to be found in our upland blanket bog sites, like along the Antrim Hills there, or in the Sperrins, where there has now been a few records which have been recorded there in the past few years. Think actually that it's probably more common than what we actually think already, or actually think at the minute. So if you're out walking in the mountains somewhere and you see a bee that has these very blonde bands then at the top, and then this very distinctive orangey red bum flying around feeding on heather, and there's a very good chance that it is a bilberry bumblebee. There is a red-tailed bumblebee which is just all black with a red bum, and so you can distinguish them then by these blonde kind of bands then towards the top of the bee, between it and the bilberry bumblebee. But yeah, they're looking for more and more records of bilberry bumblebee in Northern Ireland in particular to try and see. It only actually arrived in Ireland a number of decades ago. Nobody had recorded it before. It arrived in Wicklow, as you can see from that map there, which is now its stronghold in Ireland. And then it's gradually been moving further and further north. And so they think there's a couple of records, as I said, been coming in from the Sperrins. So they're looking to see whether or not it is a lot more prevalent than what we think. But it's such a nice species. So nice to see on a sunny day when you're out in the hills. And I lastly just wanted to give a few examples of some places that you might want to go and explore to go and see some of these things potentially. Mourne Mountains, great spot, lots of walks to go and look for lots of peatland invertebrates and bugs and stuff in County Down. And in Antrim then, Slievenora is a site that Ulster Wildlife is currently working on with Forest Service there to restore lots of the peatland habitats up there. And the Antrim Hills Way actually goes through a big part of Slievenora. So there's good walks through there. It's a great spot to go and potentially look for bilberry bumblebee actually. Gary Bog, just outside Ballymoney, is a really, really nice example of a lowland raised bog that has this short loop walk that you can do that brings you out, and it's got these amazing pull systems. So a brilliant spot to go and look for things like four-spotted chaser and black darter dragonflies. Really, really nice. And it's not a big walk, it's just a short thing, but you can see loads in that space of time that you're there. Peatlands Park, another very good example of lowland raised bog site, loads of walks where you can see things like large heath, all those dragonfly species, green hair streak butterfly, all those sorts of things. And Cregan as well, out in mid Ulster. Great place there with a nice little boardwalk walk around the raised bog beside the centre. We now have people based out in Cregan there, one of them being Rory. And we are doing lots of work in and around that part of the world there to restore lots of peatland habitats. But there's a few great spots there that you can go and try and look out for some of these peatland inverts. And then lastly, Coca Mountain, and not just the boardwalk. In fact, I would probably advise you don't go to the boardwalk, it's too busy. But there's lots of other walks in and around the kind of lower parts of Coca through some of that amazing blanket bog that you can go to look for some of these species. So that's just a few examples there of places that you can potentially go to try and look out for some of these peatlandy bugs and beasties. And I just then wanted to finish off by giving you an idea of some of the other talks that are coming up in the next number of weeks. So we've got Dave Wall talking about our whales and our dolphins and our porpoises next week, I think that is. And then Rosemary, our head of nature recovery, is going to be talking about butterflies. And my wife, Katie, is going to be talking about bees in a few weeks then. So if you're really interested in bees and you're kind of getting interested from some of those ones that just been touched on there, then definitely tune into Katie's talk then towards the end of February about bees. And we've got Rachel then talking about restoring oysters, which is a big piece of work that Ulster Wildlife's been doing in Belfast Loch and in and around Glenarm. So they've been doing lots of amazing things there and finding lots of cool things like these nudibranchs here. So tune into that. Ema Rooney then from the Northern Ireland Raptor Study Group is doing a great talk about safeguarding Northern Ireland's raptors. So could be a really, should be a really interesting one. And then finally, we've got Damien from Cedar who's doing a talk on our dragonflies and damselflies actually. So if you want to find out anything more about some of those species that I touched on there in this talk, definitely tune into that one then halfway through March. And that is it. So I'm going to take a drink of water and stop sharing my screen. And now the plan is to go through the questions. So Rory, do you want to just read out some of the ones that we have on there?
Yep. Yeah, but feel free to continue asking them, anyone who thinks of anything while we're talking. So our first one was from H. Price, which I think you might have touched on and covered. So basically, he used to work on chalk fens and came across raft spiders there, and was just wondering, are there any here? Which as
so we don't have the great like the fen raft spider that they get over in England, in the south of England, is actually a distinct species then. So it's not the same exact species as the raft spider that we get in Ireland. And the fen raft spider that they get in the south of England is some of the like the great fen kind of parts of the world in Cambridgeshire and Lincolnshire, is a different species, and it's really rare, really like super duper duper rare. So it's not exactly the same thing, but they are very, very similar. And as I see there from H. Price, then yes, truly phobic dimensions. Yeah, that one that I saw down in Longford or wherever it was, I could not get over how big it was. It was like, it wasn't terrifying, it was amazing. I was obsessed with it whenever I was seeing it. I was trying to take as close photographs as I possibly could, but it was huge, absolutely huge. Yeah.
We've got an interesting point again from H. Price that Agent and Sable is actually from the heraldry colours. So that's obviously where the name comes from.
Oh, okay. Well, there you go. That's good. I didn't know that one. I thought Argent and Sable like meant black and white, but there you go. That makes sense.
Nice. So moving on to a question here. We've got one from Jane Ackerman. Do you know if any genetic analysis has been done on the different populations of large heath, which might explain or account for the differences in their appearance?
Gene, that is a great question. I actually don't know if there's been any genetic analysis done. That would be a great bit of research to do if it hasn't already been done. We in Northern Ireland, I think we're still really trying to get to grips of exactly where our populations are. I know for sure that we haven't done any kind of genetic analysis here. We work very closely with butterfly conservation, Northern Ireland, and they have made large heath after marsh artillery one of their real focal species. So they're only just starting to kind of get to grips with what they can do to improve conditions for it and everything. But that is something that I would definitely ask Rose about from butterfly conservation, because I always thought it was mad. I mean, see, if you just Google it, you'll see this huge variation in those spots on hind wing. And if you do a bit more research, then you see that it varies basically as you move from north to south, and it changes drastically. But I don't actually know. That's a great question, Gene. I'm going to have to actually do a bit more research after to see whether or not anybody has done anything about that. I
Well,
imagine that they must be distinct, you know, but I don't know whether or not they cross the threshold of being like, some species. There might be a Scotica species, I think actually could be potentially a Scotica species. But yeah, that's an interesting one.
so you might have been beaten to it. Peter
Oh,
Archdale
okay.
has replied, saying that a recent paper suggested that meadow brown butterfly spots appearance is correlated with the temperature, so it might be similar for large heath. So
That's
interesting.
just like Peter Archdale to know something like that. Fair play, Peter. That sounds about right. Yeah. There's lots of research has been done about how temperature impacts how a lot of invertebrates that metamorphose that go through that kind of phase of being in a pupa, how temperature impacts their development and what they look like and everything. So that makes a lot of sense then that they would be dependent. So the ones up in Scotland have to deal with a lot cooler climate, then that impacts their development in a particular way and makes them look a particular way. But that's really interesting. That's really cool.
So Frankie Smith asks, is wet woodland generally more beneficial as habitat than pure reed beds?
Oh no, right here it's potentially a can of worms there, Frankie. Um, I think it depends on who you ask. No, and it depends on what you're also thinking about. So I mean, if we're thinking about like invertebrates, I would say yeah, wet woodland is definitely more biodiverse than a reed bed. But then maybe in terms of certain bird life and stuff, you might get more species than with a reed bed. And realistically, what you would probably want is a little bit of both. And actually, we're very bad at pigeonholing landscapes and areas into particular habitats. And we've been forced into doing that for a variety of different reasons. That's how ecology has kind of been designed over the years. And things like scientific designations like ASSIs and SACs and everything have really forced us to do that. But actually, that's not really the way habitats and species kind of work. They love actually where we've lost so many species is in these transitional places where wet woodland kind of gradually turns into a reed bed or vice versa. And yeah, I don't know whether or not I would be able to say that it's more beneficial as a habitat than pure reed beds. But if you had an area that was like just whole one or the other, it's probably not going to be as good as if you had a little bit of both, depending on scale. But yeah, best is probably going to be a little bit of both types. Yeah, that's a good question.
Great. Niall asks, have you got any books you might recommend for identifying invertebrates in Ireland?
Oh my God, that should have been a question that I had thought about previously. There is a lot of good books for generally and identifying invertebrates for like Great Britain and Ireland. So there's lots of good Collins guides out there for everything from beetles to dragonflies and damselflies. The butterflies one actually is the Collins Butterflies Guide is really, really good. Or we have the Complete Guide to the Spiders of the British Isles, which is really, really intense, but it's got everything that you would ever need in it for anything you would come across in Ireland. The Natural History Book Service, NHBS, is a great place to go on, and just they have everything, absolutely everything. So if you even just Googled into the search bar invertebrates Ireland, there will be a whole host of stuff that you find on there. But generally, the Collins ones are always very good for everything. And then what do you call your man, Jeremy? Oh, there's a guy. There's guys that a butterfly book for years, which is really really good. Jeremy something that I can't quite remember. Peter Arstill will probably remember who that is.
So then our next question is from Anne and Alistair. They ask, is there any public access to any of the Lecale fens?
Unfortunately, there isn't. They're really quite dangerous places to go. So they're all privately owned. But that's that's kind of beside the point, because they're filled with lots of areas of really deep water, which is very well hidden. And generally, all those fens are just like a carpet or a mat of vegetation that's floating on very deep water. So going into them is incredibly dangerous. Whenever we are working with landowners to do work on them, we tend to actually get an amphibious vehicle brought in. So we actually have a contractor out there at the minute on Corbally, cutting away some of the reeds and some of the scrub to kind of open it up a bit more for some of those invertebrate species. But yeah, unfortunately, you can't get onto them. There is other sites, I'm sure, and Alistair, you're well aware of them, but the best fen site that I would actually recommend going to be able to get a look at some of these species is actually bracken moss, which used to be a bog many moons ago, until they took loads of peat off it and they extracted it down to the fen peat, and now it's basically a fen. But it's got loads of nice fen species there, and there's a couple of really good walks to go around. So I'm sure you probably have been there before, but just in case, yeah, it's a shame that we can't get on to the Lecale ones, but it's just probably a safer thing for everybody, to be honest.
And then I think we'll finish with as we started, with the point from H. Price, which just says, good point about the pigeonholing. It seems such a pity to clear grey willow scrub to encourage open bog.
Yes. Well, funny enough, just on Tuesday, I was on an online seminar that the National Trust were holding about trees and peat, and we're really thinking years ago it would have been completely normal mindset that if you had any kind of scrub growing on a bog, get rid of it. Shouldn't be there. Definitely don't want it. Now, the ecological thinking has definitely changed, and now we really are starting to think, well, actually, quite a lot of benefits to having a lot of trees, even on peatland sites, on the edges. I'm talking about things like the Argentine sable or the green hairstreak. They're the sort of species that really like those transitional places. So having forests that kind of gradually through over a distance turn into open bog, where you've got variation in structure and age and little pockets of different tree species and scrubby species developing in parts of the bog, then that is what we actually want, rather than just having it's bog and then there's an invisible wall there and it turns into woodland. That's not how nature works at all. You go to somewhere like Estonia or Sweden or something, their peatland is just this absolute mishmash of pine and birch woodland gradually turning into open bog and then into big open pools and everything, and then it does the other thing. It does the opposite on the other side of that and turns back into full-on woodland again. Whereas here we've just lost so much of that really pristine habitat. It's going to take a very long time before we can get any of that back. But yeah, willow scrub, there's a good example actually. Corbally fen, we want to get rid of some of the willow scrub, but we don't want to get rid of all of it, because actually that mature willow that is growing on the edges of the fen and in some little isolated pockets is actually the home to another invertebrate that I didn't even mention in this talk, which is the lunar hornet moth, which is this beautiful big moth that looks like a hornet. It's evolved to look like a giant wasp, and the larvae actually feed on willow on that site. So there's a great example of how that mix of scrubby kind of habitat and the open kind of habitat benefits different things. So in the open habitat, we get marsh fritillary butterfly, loves all those open bits for devil's bit scabious and everything. And then in the scrubby bits, then we've got things like lunar hornet moth, rather than just having a one size fits all approach to everything. So yeah.
And then I think there's just one last question on what you're saying there from Oshin is, would that not drop the water table, encourage peat composition, decomposition?
So it's never a straightforward thing. So if you've got a bog which is degraded and it's been drained, and as a result, maybe you've got scrub and trees growing on it, that's maybe a different matter. But we've kind of fallen into this trap of thinking that if a tree is on a bog, then it's in the wrong place. But actually, when we look at really intact ecosystems in those other parts of the world that I'm talking about, we get trees growing in patches of bog that are perfectly naturally able to sustain themselves there. They will, in many cases, grow unbelievably slowly. So you might get something like a Scots pine growing in a nice patch of open bog in the middle of the cairngorms, and it's only 5 or 6 feet tall, but it's like, 20 years old. Because it struggles. It's just about managed to grab hold enough to be able to grow, but it's not growing like the clappers. It's absolutely, really, really it's just surviving. And it might only be able to grow a bit more whenever you get a slightly dry spell, and then whenever it's really wet, then it doesn't really grow at all. And then it might be another couple of years and it might grow just an inch. So I think, yeah, we basically we need to rethink that kind of relationship a bit more now with when it comes to trees and peat. If it's a degraded ecosystem which is really heavily modified and you've got trees growing on it, yeah, that's a cause and effect there. But actually, when we've got intact ecosystems, if we start to see things like trees integrating into there, then we probably just need to let it take its course and see what happens, and kind of let it make its own decisions, and see what benefits come from them.
Great. I think that's everything in terms of questions. Yeah.
Somebody's just asked there, what does exuvia mean? That just is the remnant whenever the remnant casing of the pupa whenever a moth or a butterfly or something emerges. So whenever it leaves that behind, then that's called an exuvia. Just got edge effects were argued for Redgrave fen when EU funding obtained and the water company agreed to stop extracting from it, not fully resolved. I think that was possibly they were talking about the fens in that talk the other day. And yeah, there's a lot of upland sites where historically we have been very worried about trees and thought like, oh, should trees would never grow up there. It'd never grow up there. They will. They definitely will. If you let them, they will definitely grow up there. They'll quite happily grow up there. And yeah, I think we're going to potentially see some significant changes in the landscapes over the next wee while as these kind of mindsets evolve. Okay, cool. Yeah, well, thank you very much, folks. And thank you, Rory, for all your help. Appreciate it. Like I said before, lots of other nice talks that are coming up there, so please definitely book on to those. And please, if you can, fill out the little feedback form. That would be really appreciated if you could. And also, if anybody isn't a member already, then please do think about joining as a member, because it really helps us and supports us doing the work that we do. So a lot of the peatland restoration work that we do, for example, then we wouldn't be able to do that without the support of our members. So if anybody isn't already, please do think about joining, because it really helps. But yeah, that's us for the evening. So I'll let you get on with the rest of your evening, whatever you have planned. And thank you very, very much for joining. Really appreciate it. Okay, folks. See you later.
Thank you. Bye.